Okay, I got distracted in the other book and I did in the other video and I didn't actually explain. So how I would do it, I'm going to change things around. So I'm going to have like the overall character because there's some characters that are constantly mentioned throughout it. Now, clearly, it's someone who wrote Genesis or a group of people who wrote Genesis, and then a bunch of other people have read Genesis and then have taken on the stories of Genesis and have tried to make more and more stories. So say there's talks about Israelites, that other people have come and made stories about the Israelites. And yeah, the stories about the Israelites kept going. So imagine you just written a story about, I don't know, two people, and then two people had these kids, and then two people had these kids, and two people. So you've made a Genesis story about a chronologue of people, a certain number of people all following down, and then imagine a whole bunch of other people come 100, 200 years, maybe three, maybe 1,000 years later and said, you know what, I like these stories and I'm going to tell more stories or add more stories to it. And so that's basically what happened. So you got the Genesis, which is the first book. I don't know if it was actually first written, but I feel like it was because they seem to be the earlier books. And then Exodus, and then the five or six other ones are basically just continuing the story. So after Abraham, then Moses, then I don't know what the story is, but there's a certain point that it cuts off. When does that? I can actually tell you. Um, Jacob, yeah, Moses is basically so anything. Genesis is the beginning, so the beginning of time till Moses, and then after, and then as soon as Exodus comes, you've got Moses, and then someone's done basically said, oh, I love the Genesis, I'm going to continue with the sort of birth line of this fictional story, but that they probably believed that it was the truth because they didn't know who the truth is, what the truth is. And so they've come up with other stories of Moses and all the stories of Moses, and the Ten Commandments, and just lots of stuff. And then they started talking about Moses' sister, and they've added, I think actually Exodus is mostly just and the Promised Land, but yeah. And then it gets to Joshua, which is book 6. It starts talking about Rahab and the stories, and I don't know. It's just a series of stories that continue from each other. Now, to think that they were, miraculously made is kind of crazy. I feel like it's obvious that whoever's written these follow-on books have just read the first books and just followed it on by, oh, and this is what happens to these children, and this is what happens to these children, and this is what happens to those children, and they've just created this completely fictional thing. I don't know where the origins of the Jewish people came from. I know that they were important because for the Israelites to seem real, people would need to know like kind of who it is pointing at. Although yeah, I have to admit, if sort of the Christians and the Jewish people are from the sort of Israelites, and it's from Jacob. Jacob had a stepbrother, which was Azam or whatever that one. The um, um, Ishmael. Yeah, they're supposed to be Ishmael and Isaac are the two sons of ones. I know one's from the Moses one. But yeah, I have been putting a lot of emphasis on the Israel line. And it's true that the Muslim believe that they're not from the Israel line, which, okay, I don't think it's true. I don't think Abraham existed, therefore it's not possible that I think it's just divide. It's just people wanting to believe, Jewish people a long time ago and Muslim people wanting to believe that they were different, hearing about these stories. Oh, well, this is the reason why Jewish people and Muslims are different, because you're from this son of Abraham and you're from this son of Abraham. And I really just believe that it's all nonsense. But both of the religions supporting this Abraham figure, including Christianity, they all support this Abraham figure. But by doing that, you've actually just added more divide, because you've given more power to Abraham. All the Muslims believe in him, and the Christians believe him, and the Jewish people believe him. So therefore, he must be real. And that's just not how I see it. I just see it as people not knowing their origins, and so believing in fairy tales. And that's really how it is. But yeah, it is interesting how I do focus a lot on Israel, and it's interesting that the Muslims aren't from that line. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, so I think how I would have it is I would have like the overall, because there are a lot of characters that seem to be mentioned in like all the books, which is Israel, Jerusalem, um, and no, it's the Mount Zion, or the Judah, and and Zion, and Tamar as well is also mentioned in two or three of them. So that's mentioned in a few of the books. So I would probably have the books, if I was to do a book, I'd probably have those characters first, the characters that kind of focus throughout the whole of the Bible. I mean, technically, they're not real characters, and I don't want to keep having to mention that, but at the same time, I want that to be very clear that none of these are true. But the people that have read the later books have just read the earlier books and have just, followed on with the stories whilst believing that these people are real when really they're not real people. They're just fictional characters talked about in multiple places, which is possible. But yeah, so I would have that, and then I'd focus on the Genesis book, which is just the big line up till Moses, and then the Exodus is Moses, and then afterwards it's got Joshua, which has got Rahab, and there was some Lord kills by sending hailstones, which again is not a real true story, but I made I don't know what I've written about that, but I'm sure it's probably just to show how I didn't do any of this. And then there's Judges, which is I can't Jesphet's or something, daughter. Can't say the name. And then there's got Deborah and Uriel, and it's just lots of little stories basically. And then the Ruth book, and then the Samuel and the Kings, and so I've placed it in like box in folders, and I've put all the characters that represent that thing. And I think that's probably the better way to do it, because at least then it feels like it's in order, and it feels a bit more where I've got it from, because I'm not just talking about random stories. I'm talking about stories that people have kind of wrongly worshipped for a long time, and all the way up to Jonah, book 39. And I don't know if there's any other ones that have been included, but yeah, I think that when it comes to Israel, I might actually change it a bit, and make it clear that Israel seems to be a bit like Jesus. Jesus could represent just Jesus, everyone. It could represent Christ. It could represent Jesus of Nazareth, or the false Christ, or the Antichrist. And so there's a lot of things that it can represent. And I feel like Israel as well can represent the same thing. So I probably need to I probably just need to do a page where I say how Israel could represent just a woman, and the Israelites are just could just represent all of Dala's children, which is just everyone on earth. Or it could represent Eve's son, because Israel is supposed to be the firstborn. And well, technically, if Eve, had a child, then Israel, her son, whatever you want to call her, call him Satan, Lucifer, son of God, or whatever. That's all. That is Israel and the tribes, and so that there's that as a way of looking at it. And then there's also um, the Israelites, as in just a fictional story that people, a lot of it, especially in Exodus, is just talking about Israel as in just people making up fantasy stories about war and bloodshed and all the things that God said and do. And just it's a lot of the Old Testament is just fantasy stories about a group of people. Um, but through these fantasy stories about a group of people, I feel like there is other things to be said. But yeah.